I'm Corinne, 38, standing in my parents' living room, coffee mug, warm in my hand. The air smells of pot roast and old wood. Grandpa Leora, his voice gravely, looks at me and asks, Corinne, you like the house, my parents? Thelma and Bernice go still. Their eyes flick to each other, then away. The room feels too small, the silence too heavy. I don't answer. I can't. That question isn't about the house. It's a crack in something I've ignored too long. Something's hidden here, and it's about to break open. Ever felt a truth you couldn't name stick around? The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I kept holding it like it could anchor me. The living room buzzed with small-talk cousins laughing over some old story, but Grandpa Leora's question hung in the air sharp as a splinter. My parents, Thelma and Bernice, moved through the room like they were dodging something. Thelma's smile was tight, her hands fussing with a stack of napkins. Bernice kept his eyes on the TV volume low, pretending to care about the game. I stood by the window, watching them, feeling like a stranger in a house I'd grown up in. I'm a mechanic, 38 years old, used to fixing things that break. Engines make sense, bolts, gaskets, timing belts. You find the fault, you turn the wrench. But this house, these people, they were a machine I couldn't crack. I'd moved out at 19, chasing a life that didn't feel so heavy, but I never asked why this place always felt like it was holding its breath. Now I couldn't stop wondering. I caught Bernice glancing at the staircase just for a second, his jaw tight. It stirred something, a memory from when I was 15, sneaking downstairs for a glass of water at midnight. Their voices had drifted from the kitchen, low and sharp. The deed's not right, Thelma had whispered. We can't keep pretending. Bernice had hissed back. We have to. I'd stood there barefoot, on the cold floor, not understanding, but knowing it was something I wasn't supposed to hear. I never brought it up. Kids don't ask about things like that. But now that memory was clawing its way back, and I couldn't shake it. The front door creaked open, and Petra, our neighbor, stepped in with a plate of cookies. She was in her 60s, hair gray, and pulled back, her smile too polite. Thought I'd bring something sweet, she said, setting the plate on the table. The room nodded, murmured thanks, but I watched her eyes linger on the walls, the ceiling, like she was seeing something we weren't. This house, she said almost to herself, it's got stories, doesn't it? Nobody answered. Thelma's hands froze over the napkins. Bernice coughed too loud and turned up the TV. I felt my chest tighten, not anger exactly, but something close, like a belt cinched one notch too far. Petra's words weren't just small talk. She knew something same as Leora. I wanted to ask right there, but the room was too full. Too many eyes. I'd learned early to keep my mouth shut when things got tense. Swallowing questions was easier than dealing with the answers. But this time, it wasn't sitting right. Later in the kitchen, I found Thelma alone rinsing dishes under the faucet. The water hissed, steam rising, but her hands moved too fast, scrubbing plates that were already clean. I leaned against the counter, mug still in my grip. What was that about? I said, keeping my voice low. What Leora asked, about the house. She didn't look up. It's nothing, Corinne, just old man talk. Her voice was flat, but her knuckles whitened on the sponge. I waited thinking she'd say more, but she just kept scrubbing. I'd seen her like this before, shutting me out when I got too close to something she didn't want to touch. At 15, I'd let it go. At 38, it stung different. like I was still a kid who didn't deserve the truth. I set the mug down harder than I meant to. The clink made her flinch. It didn't feel like nothing I said. She turned off the faucet slow and dried her hands on a towel. Her eyes met mine for a second, then slid away. "You're reading too much into it," she said, and walked out, leaving me with the hum of the fridge and a question I couldn't unask. I stood in the kitchen, the fridge's hum filling the space Thelma left behind. Her words echoed sharp and final, like a door slammed shut. I wanted to follow her demand more, but my feet stayed rooted. I'd spent years fixing things, carburetors, transmissions, things that made sense. People were messier. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, the cold glass biting my palm, and stepped onto the back porch. The night air was cool, the yard dark except for the glow of a streetlight. Petra's comment about the house gnawed at me. Stories she'd said. What kind? I leaned against the railing, sipping the beer, trying to piece it together. The house wasn't just a house. It was a weight my parents carried, something they wouldn't share. I thought about Bernice's glance at the staircase earlier. It wasn't random. He'd looked there before years ago, when I'd come home late from a high school party. I'd caught him standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up like he was waiting for something to come down. I'd laughed it off, then blamed it on him being tired. Now it felt different, like he was guarding something. I finished the beer, the bitter taste lingering. Inside the gathering was winding down voices, quieter plates stacked in the sink. I went back in, dodging small talk, and found Bernice in the living room, flipping through channels. Thelma was upstairs, probably hiding. I sat across from him, the couch creaking under my weight. "You gonna tell me what's going on?" I said, keeping my voice even. He didn't look at me. The TV flickered some late-night ad about car insurance. "Nothing's going on," he said, his tone clipped like he was reading a script. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, watching his hands. They were steady, but his thumb pressed hard against the remote, like he was holding himself together. "Petra said something about the house having stories," I said. "What's she mean?" His thumb stopped moving. For a second, I thought he'd answer. Then he clicked the TV off the room, going dark except for a lamp in the corner. "Petra talks too much," he said, standing up. "You should get some sleep." He walked out, leaving me with the empty screen and a tightening in my gut. I wasn't a kid anymore, but he still treated me like one, shutting me out with a pat on the head. I stayed there, staring at the staircase he'd glanced at earlier. It led to the attic, a place I'd never been allowed to go. When I was young, they'd said it was just storage locked for safety. I'd believed them. Now I wasn't so sure. I stood, my boots heavy on the floor, and moved toward the stairs. The house was quiet now, the last guests gone. I stopped at the base, hand on the banister, looking up into the dark. Something told me the answer was up there, locked away with whatever my parents were hiding. I didn't climb the stairs, not yet. But I knew I would. Tomorrow, I'd start digging, find out what they wouldn't tell me. The truth was close, and I was done waiting. I woke up the next morning with a headache, the kind that sits behind your eyes and makes everything feel sharp. The house was quiet, my parents already gone to their jobs. I stood at the base of the staircase again, the attic door at the top like a closed mouth. I didn't have a key, never had, but the urge to break it open was strong. Instead, I grabbed my jacket and drove to the county records office. If the answers weren't in the house, they'd be somewhere else. The office smelled of dust and old paper. I waited at the counter, my boots tapping on the linoleum, until a clerk named Veda looked up from her computer. She was in her 50s, bored, her glasses perched low on her nose. Property records, she said like she'd heard it 1,000 times. I gave her the address, my parents' address, and watched her shuffle to a back room. My hands were in my pockets, but they wanted to move to do something. I'd spent years fixing engines, knowing exactly where to apply pressure. This was different. I was reaching for something I couldn't see. Veda came back with a thin file, sliding it across the counter. "Here's what we've got," she said already, turning back to her screen. I opened it, my pulse quickening. The house wasn't in my parents' names. It was tied to a trust, something called the Mabel Whitaker Trust. The name hit me like a cold wind. Mabel. Petra's comment about the house's stories came back, but this wasn't a story. It was a fact, black ink on a county form. The trust was set up 20 years ago, right around the time I moved out. I flipped through the pages, looking for Thelma or Bernice's names, but they were only listed as tenants. Tenants. In the house I grew up in. "Know anything about this, Mabel?" I asked Veda, keeping my voice steady. She shrugged, not looking up. "Her name pops up in old trusts around here. Developer maybe, long time ago." Her indifference made my jaw tighten. I wanted to press, but she was already typing, dismissing me without a word. I took the file, paid for copies, and walked out, the papers heavy in my hand. Driving back, I kept thinking about that trust. My parents' tenants. It didn't add up. They'd raised me in that house, hung pictures, painted walls, acted like it was theirs. Why hide it? I pulled into their driveway, the house looking smaller somehow, like it was shrinking under the weight of what I'd found. Bernice's truck was there, which meant he was home early. I didn't want to wait. I walked inside, the file tucked under my arm, and found him in the kitchen pouring coffee. "We need to talk," I said, setting the papers on the table. He didn't turn around, just kept stirring sugar into his mug. About what he said, his voice low, like he already knew. I opened the file, pointing to the trust's name. "This. The house isn't yours. It's in some trust. Mabel Whitaker. Who is she?" His shoulders stiffened, the spoon clinking against the mug. He turned his eyes hard, not meeting mine. "Leave it alone, Corinne," he said, each word clipped. "You don't need to know everything." It was the same tone he'd used last night, but sharper now, like a warning. I felt something crack inside me. Not anger yet, but close. I'd spent my life respecting their boundaries, staying quiet. But this was different. This was my home too, or at least I thought it was. I stood there, the kitchen table between us, the file open like a wound. Bernice's coffee mug sat untouched, steam curling up in thin wisps. My question about Mabel Whitaker hung in the air unanswered. I wanted to push, to make him talk, but my throat tightened, the words stuck. I'd always backed off when he got like this, eyes narrow, mouth set like a man guarding a gate. At 38, I still felt like the kid who didn't dare cross him. "You're not going to tell me, are you?" I said, my voice quieter than I meant. Bernice picked up his mug, took a slow sip, then set it down. "Some things aren't your business," he said, his tone flat but heavy, like a door locking. He walked past me, brushing my shoulder, and headed for the living room. I heard the TV click on the low drone of a sports announcer filling the house. I stayed put staring at the papers. The Mabel Whittaker Trust. Tenants. The words didn't fit the life I'd known summers, mowing the lawn winters, shoveling the driveway, my parents arguing over bills at this very table. They'd acted like owners, like this was their place, their life. But it wasn't. I felt a hollow ache, not just for the house, but for the trust I'd put in them. They'd built a lie, and I'd lived in it. The back door opened, and Thelma stepped in her coat, dusted with early snow. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes flicking to the file. "What's that?" she said, her voice sharp like she already knew. I didn't answer right away. I wanted her to feel the weight of it the way I did. "Records," I said, finally tapping the papers. "About the house. It's not yours. Never was." Her face changed, not shock, but something worse, resignation, like she'd been waiting for this moment. She set her purse down slow and moved to the sink, turning on the faucet. Water hissed, filling the silence. "You shouldn't be digging into that," she said, her back to me, her hands busy with a glass she didn't need to wash. I watched her shoulders tense, waiting for more, but she gave me nothing. I felt the room shrink, the walls pressing in. I wasn't angry, not exactly, just lost, like I'd walked into a house I didn't recognize. I wanted to grab her, make her look at me, but my hands stayed at my sides, heavy, useless. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, the words barely audible. She didn't turn around. The faucet kept running, the sound louder than it should have been. I heard Bernice shift in the living room, the couch creaking. He was listening. I knew it, but he didn't come back. Thelma shut off the water, dried her hands, and walked out, her footsteps soft but deliberate, like she was escaping. I stood alone, the file still open, the kitchen clock ticking too loud. I wasn't their son right now. I was an intruder, asking questions I had no right to. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I grabbed the papers and left, the door slamming behind me, the sound echoing in my chest. I couldn't stay in that house another second. The papers from the records office burned in my hand as I drove to Petra's place, the truck's engine rumbling louder than my thoughts. She lived a mile away, in a small house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. I didn't call ahead. I didn't care. I needed answers, and she'd hinted at something last night. I parked my boots, crunching on the gravel, and knocked hard. The door opened slow, Petra's face wary, her grey hair loose around her shoulders. "Corinne," she said, stepping back. "Didn't expect you." Her voice was careful, like she was measuring me. I held up the file, my fingers tight on the edges. "You said the house has stories. I need to know what you meant." She hesitated, then nodded me inside. The living room smelled of lavender and old books, a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. She sat on a worn couch, motioning for me to take a chair. I didn't sit. I stood, the file still in my hand, my pulse loud in my ears. "The house isn't my parents'," I said. "It's in a trust. Mabel Whittaker. You know something. Tell me." Petra's eyes flicked to the floor, then back to me. She sighed long and heavy, like she'd been carrying this as long as my parents had. "It was after your grandpa died," she said, her voice low. "Leora. He wasn't what you thought. He had debts, bad ones, gambling mostly. Owed a lot to the wrong people." I felt my stomach twist, but I didn't move, didn't speak. She went on. "Mabel. She was a developer back then, sharp as a tack. She bailed him out, took the house as collateral. Your parents got to stay, but it was a gift, not ownership. They never told you because they were ashamed. I gripped the file harder, the paper crumpling. Leora, the man who taught me how to fish, who sat quiet at family dinners, had gambled our home away. My parents had lived in that shame, raising me in a house that wasn't theirs. I wanted to ask why they didn't fight, why they let it happen, but my throat felt like it was closing. Petra watched me, her eyes soft but steady, like she knew I was breaking inside. "You sure you want to keep digging?" she said, leaning forward. "Some things don't get better when you know." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I turned and walked out the door, clicking shut behind me. My truck was still running, the headlights cutting through the dusk. I got in, slammed the door, and drove back to my parents' house, the file on the seat beside me. They were in the dining room when I walked in, Thelma setting plates, Bernice reading the paper. The normalcy of it made my skin crawl. I dropped the file on the table, the thud loud in the quiet. "Petra told me," I said, my voice low but shaking. "About Leora, the gambling, the deal with Mabel." Thelma's hand froze on a plate, her face paling. Bernice lowered the paper, his eyes locked on the table. "Corinne." Thelma started, her voice barely a whisper, but I cut her off. "Don't. Just don't." I felt something snap, not loud, not angry, just a quiet break, like a wire stretched too far. Thelma's eyes filled with tears, and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. Bernice just sat there silent, his fingers tight on the newspaper. I stood over them, waiting for something, anything but. The silence grew heavy and sharp, cutting deeper than words could. The dining room was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. Thelma's hand stayed over her face, her shoulders shaking, but no sound came. Bernice's fingers crumpled the edge of the newspaper, his knuckles white. I stood there, the file on the table, like a blade between us. I wanted them to say something, to explain, to make it make sense, but they didn't. The silence was their answer, and it cut deeper than any words could have. I sat down, my legs heavy, the chair scraping against the floor. My hands rested on the table, close to the file, but not touching it. I could feel the weight of Petra's words, Leora's debts, the house that was never ours. My whole life, I thought this place was solid, a foundation. Now it was just walls, a deal made to cover a dead man's shame. I looked at Thelma, waiting for her to lift her head to meet my eyes, but she didn't move. Bernice cleared his throat, the sound rough, like he was pulling himself together. "It was for you," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. "We kept it quiet, so you could grow up normal, so you wouldn't know." I stared at him, my jaw tight, my thoughts spinning. Normal? I'd spent my childhood in this house, sleeping under a roof that wasn't ours, eating at a table paid for with lies. They'd protected me, they said, but it felt like betrayal, like I'd been a stranger in my own life. "Why didn't you fight it?" I asked, my voice steady but thin, like it might crack if I pushed too hard. Bernice looked away, his eyes on the window, the dark outside reflecting back. "We couldn't," he said. "Mabel had us. Leora's debts were bigger than the house. It was that or lose everything." His voice dropped, barely audible. "We chose you." I wanted to believe him, to feel something soft, something forgiving. But all I felt was cold. They'd chosen me, but they'd also chosen silence, letting me build a life on a foundation that wasn't real. I thought of the times I'd fixed their car, mowed their lawn, sat at this table for holidays, never knowing. My hands curled into fists, not angry, just empty, like I was trying to hold on to something that wasn't there. Thelma finally lowered her hands, her face wet, her eyes red but steady. "We didn't want you to hate him," she said, her voice small. "Leora was your grandfather. We thought, if we carried it, you wouldn't have to." Her words landed like stones, heavy and final. I didn't hate Leora, not yet. But I hated this secret. They'd buried this house that wasn't a home, this truth that made me question every memory I had. I pushed the chair back, the legs loud against the floor. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I walked to the door, my boots heavy, my chest tighter than it had ever been. Outside, the night was cold, the stars sharp against the sky. I stood on the porch, the file still inside, the truth laid bare. I felt hollow, like the man I'd been had been scraped out, leaving nothing but a shell staring into the dark. I woke up the next morning with a decision already made. The hollow feeling from last night hadn't left, but it wasn't paralyzing anymore. It was fuel. I showered, dressed, and drove to Mabel Whitaker's address, the one I'd found in the trust papers. My truck's tires crunched on the road, the engine's hum steadying me. I wasn't angry, not exactly, just done waiting for someone else to hand me the truth. I'd spent too long fixing other people's machines. This was mine to repair. Mabel lived in a condo complex, all beige stucco and manicured shrubs. I parked, checked the address again, and walked to her door. The morning was crisp, the kind that makes your breath catch. I knocked, my knuckles firm against the wood. The door opened, and there she was, 78, maybe older, her hair white, and cropped, her eyes sharp, like she'd been expecting me. "You're Corinne," she said, not a question. She stepped aside, letting me in. Her place was clean, sparse. A coffee table with a single magazine, a couch that looked barely used. I stood in the middle of the room, hands in my pockets, feeling the weight of my own questions. "I know about the house," I said, my voice low but clear. "The trust, Leora's debts. I want the full story." Mabel didn't flinch. She sat down, crossing her legs, her hands folded like she was about to negotiate. "Sit," she said, pointing to a chair. I didn't move. She nodded like she understood and leaned back. "Your grandfather was a good man but weak," she said. "Gambling ate him up. He owed more than he could pay, tens of thousands to people who don't wait." I stepped in, took the house as collateral, set up the trust to keep him out of trouble. "Your parents got to stay, but the house is mine. Always was." Her words were clean, no apology, no softness. I felt my jaw tighten, not at her, but at the image of Leora, his quiet laugh, his calloused hands teaching me to cast a line, crumbling into a man who'd sold our home to save himself. I wanted to hate Mabel, to see her as the villain, but she was just a woman who'd made a deal. The real betrayal was his. "Why didn't you tell them it wasn't theirs?" I asked, my voice steady, though my chest felt like it was caving in. Mabel tilted her head, studying me. They knew, she said. They chose to live with it. For you, I assume. Her eyes didn't waver, and I felt exposed, like she saw right through my need for answers. I shifted my weight, my boots scuffing the floor. I want the trust documents, I said. All of them. It wasn't a request. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. She walked to a small desk in the corner and pulled out a folder thick with papers. This is everything, she said, handing it to me. Her fingers brushed mine, cool and deliberate. Be careful what you do with it. Trusts like this don't break easy. I took the folder, its weight heavier than it should have been. I didn't open it, not yet. I nodded, turned, and walked out the door, clicking shut behind me. The morning air hit my face sharp and clean, but my mind was already turning, planning. I wasn't done. Not with Mabel, not with the truth. I was just starting. I sat in my truck, the folder from Mabel resting on the passenger seat, its edges worn, but heavy with answers I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. The engine idled, a low rumble that matched the pulse in my temples. I didn't open the folder. Not yet. My hand stayed on the wheel, gripping it like I could steer my way out of this mess. Mabel's words kept circling: Leora's debts, the house as collateral, my parents' silence. It wasn't just a house. It was every memory I'd built, every assumption I'd carried, now cracked like a windshield hit by a stone. I drove to my shop, the place where I could think straight. The garage smelled of oil and metal tools lined up on the workbench like soldiers. I set the folder down next to a half-rebuilt carburetor, the papers looking out of place among wrenches and bolts. I wanted to work, to lose myself in something I could fix, but my eyes kept drifting to the folder. I knew what it held: legal terms, dates, signatures, but I wasn't ready to face it. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to know what I was fighting for. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Celine. I let it go to voicemail, not because I didn't want to talk, but because I didn't know what to say. She'd been patient, but I could feel her pulling back, tired of my obsession with a house that wasn't mine. I didn't blame her. I was tired too. But this wasn't about the house anymore. It was about me, about taking back something I'd let slip away: control, maybe, or just the right to know my own life. I picked up the folder, flipped it open. Pages of dense text clauses about ownership terms I didn't fully understand. But one line stood out: the trust allowed Mabel's company to reclaim the house if certain conditions weren't met. Conditions my parents had never mentioned. I felt a slow burn in my chest, not rage, but something sharper: clarity. They'd lived under the shadow, and I'd been too blind to see it. I wasn't going to stay blind. I called Verna, a lawyer I'd worked with once on a shop contract. Her office was small, tucked above a deli, smelling of pastrami and paper. I walked in, folder in hand, and laid it on her desk. I need you to look at this, I said, my voice even, like I was asking her to check an invoice. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the top page, and frowned. This is a trust document, she said. Complicated. You sure you want to open this can of worms? I'm sure, I said, meeting her eyes. I wasn't asking for permission. She nodded, flipped through a few pages, then set it down. I'll need time, she said. But I'll tell you now, trusts like this are tight. You might not like what you find. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I thanked her, left the folder with her, and walked out. Back in my truck, I sat for a moment, the deli's neon sign flickering in the dusk. I wasn't fixing this for my parents or for Leora's ghost. I was doing it for me. I started the engine, the sound steady, certain. I was moving forward no matter what came next. The folder was gone, but its weight was still with me, and I was ready to carry it. I left Werner's office and drove back to my shop, the road blurring under a grey sky. The folder was gone, handed over to someone who could make sense of it, but I still felt its weight like a stone in my gut. I'd taken a step, maybe the first real one, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like I'd opened a door I couldn't close. My phone sat silent in my pocket. No calls from Thelma or Bernice. They didn't know I'd gone to Mabel, didn't know I'd hired Werner. I wasn't ready to tell them. At the shop, I tried to focus, tearing down an old Chevy's transmission. The bolts were stubborn, rusted, and my wrench slipped, slicing my knuckle. Blood welled up red against the grease on my skin. I cursed under my breath, wrapped it in a rag, and kept working. The pain was sharp, grounding, something I could understand. But my mind kept drifting to Werner's warning about the trust, to Mabel's calm certainty, to the house that wasn't ours. I'd spent my life fixing things, but this wasn't a machine. This was my family, and I was tearing it apart. Celine called that evening, her voice soft but edged. "You coming over?" she asked. I was at my apartment, a small place I'd rented after moving out of my parents' house years ago. I looked at the empty beer bottle on my counter, the stack of unopened mail. "Not tonight," I said. "Got some things to sort out." She paused, the silence heavy. "You're shutting me out," she said, not accusing, just stating it. I didn't argue. She was right. I'd been pulling away not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to carry this and her at the same time. I hung up my thumb, lingering on the phone screen. I wanted to call her back to explain, but what would I say? That my parents' house, my childhood, was built on a lie. That I was chasing a truth that might cost them everything. I set the phone down and paced the small living room, my boots loud on the cheap hardwood. The walls felt too close, the air too still. The next morning, Werner called. "I've gone through the trust," she said, her voice crisp, professional. "It's tight, Corinne. Mabel's company has a partial claim, and there's a clause your parents have to maintain the property or it reverts to her. They've been paying taxes, upkeep, but it's not theirs. If you push, they could lose it." I leaned against my kitchen counter, the phone cold against my ear. "What's my move?" I asked. She sighed. "You don't have one. Not unless you want to risk everything." I thanked her and hung up my hand, shaking slightly. I'd wanted answers, and now I had them, but they didn't fix anything. They just made the hole deeper. I drove to my parents' house unannounced, the truck rattling over familiar roads. They were in the backyard when I arrived, Thelma pruning roses, Bernice raking leaves. They looked up as I walked over, their faces guarded like they sensed what was coming. "I know about the trust," I said, standing by the fence, my voice low but firm. "I saw Mabel. Got the papers. It's not yours." Thelma's pruning shears stopped mid-cut, a rosebud falling to the ground. Bernice's rake went still, his hands tight on the handle. Neither of them spoke. The air felt thick, like before a storm, and I stood there waiting for something to break. The backyard was still, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves under Bernice's rake. Thelma stared at the fallen rosebud, her shears limp in her hand. My words hung between us, heavy like smoke that wouldn't clear. I'd expected anger, maybe shouting, but this was worse. Just silence, thick and unyielding. I stood by the fence, my arms crossed, waiting for them to say something, anything. But they didn't. Bernice's eyes stayed on the ground, his rake motionless now. Thelma turned away, her movements slow, like she was carrying a weight I couldn't see. "I'm not trying to hurt you," I said, my voice low, almost lost in the breeze. But I had to know. Bernice's jaw tightened, just a flicker, but he didn't look up. Thelma knelt, picking up the rosebud, her fingers trembling as she tucked it into her pocket. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a wall going up. I wanted to cross it to make them see I wasn't the enemy, but my feet stayed planted. I went back to my truck, the door creaking as I climbed in. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing them still standing there, separate, unmoving. My chest felt tight, not with anger, but with something heavier, guilt maybe, for dragging their secret into the open. I'd wanted the truth, but now it was splitting us apart and I didn't know how to stop it. At the shop, I tried to lose myself in work, tearing apart an old Ford's alternator. But my hands weren't steady. I dropped a socket, the metal clanging against the concrete floor louder than it should have been. A client, a regular, who brought his pickup in every few months, noticed. "You okay, Corinne?" he asked, leaning against the counter. I nodded, wiping grease off my hands, but he didn't look convinced. "You're off today," he said, and left it at that. I finished the job, but it was sloppy, the kind of work I'd have redone if I'd caught it in time. He didn't come back after that. That night, Celine showed up at my apartment unannounced. She stood in the doorway, her coat still on, her eyes searching mine. "You're not talking to me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm right here, and you're somewhere else." I leaned against the counter, my hands gripping the edge, wanting to tell her everything. Mabel, the trust, my parents' silence, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm trying," I said finally, but it sounded weak, like an excuse. She stepped closer, her hand brushing my arm, but didn't push. "I can't keep waiting for you to show up," she said, and walked out, leaving the door half open. I didn't follow her. I sat on the couch, the apartment too quiet, the hum of the fridge the only sound. My eyes fell on the stack of unopened mail bills. I'd ignored, a life I'd let slide while chasing this truth. Werner's words echoed, the trust was airtight, the house could be lost. I'd pushed, and now everything was slipping. My parents, Celine, my work. I sat there, staring at the half-open door, the cold air creeping in, and felt the weight of what I'd done settle into my bones, heavy and final. I sat in my truck outside Werner's office, the engine off, the world quiet, except for the faint tick of cooling metal. I told her to stop digging into the trust. No more fighting, no more chasing papers that wouldn't change the past. The house wasn't mine, never was, and I couldn't make it right for my parents. I leaned back, my hands loose on the wheel, and let that truth settle. It didn't burn anymore. It just was. I drove to my new apartment, a small place across town, all bare walls and unpacked boxes. The lease was month to month, nothing permanent, but it was mine. I dropped my keys on the counter, the clink loud in the empty space. Celine hadn't called since she left my old place, and I hadn't reached out. I wanted to, but the words weren't there yet. I'd been carrying too much, and she'd felt it the way you feel a storm before it hits. At the shop, I started showing up earlier, staying later. The work was steadying bolts that fit engines, that hummed when I got them right. I rebuilt a carburetor for a guy's old Mustang, my hands moving with a rhythm I'd almost forgotten. When I handed him the keys, he grinned, said it ran better than it had in years. I nodded, said nothing, but felt a small spark of something like pride. Not loud, just enough to keep going. I bought a notebook, cheap spiral bound, and started writing things down. Not the house, not Leora's debts, but smaller stuff. What I ate, what I fixed, what the sky looked like at dusk. It wasn't about answers. It was about keeping track, proving I was here. I'd spent years holding my breath, waiting for my parents to explain, for the world to make sense. Now I was just breathing. I drove to see Leora one evening, the nursing home smelling of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. He was in a wheelchair by the window, thinner than I remembered, his hands folded in his lap. I sat across from him, the silence between us, comfortable, not heavy. "I know about the house," I said, my voice even. "What you did?" His eyes met mine, cloudy but sharp, and he nodded just once. I didn't ask for more. I didn't need to. The truth was out, and I was starting to let it go. I left his room, the hallway lights harsh against the evening dark. Outside, I stood by my truck, the air cool, the stars faint above the city's glow. I didn't feel fixed, didn't feel whole, but I felt present, like I was finally standing in my own life. I took a breath, slow and deep, and let it out, watching it fade into the night. I started keeping the notebook in my truck, tucked under the seat, its pages filling with small things, oil changes, coffee orders, the way the shop's fluorescent lights buzzed at night. It wasn't about fixing anything, just marking time, proving I was moving through it. I'd stopped calling Thelma and Bernice every day. When I did visit, we talked about the weather, my shop, their garden. The house wasn't mentioned. It was like we'd all agreed to let it sit, a weight we no longer carried together. Celine came by the apartment one night, her knock soft but certain. I opened the door, and she stood there, her scarf loose around her neck, her eyes steady. "You're different," she said, stepping inside. I didn't ask what she meant. I poured her coffee, and we sat on my couch, the silence between us, warm, not heavy. She reached for my hand, her fingers light but firm, and I let her hold it. I didn't need to explain. She stayed, and that was enough. Work became my rhythm again. I fixed a busted radiator for a woman who tipped me with homemade cookies, the kind with too much sugar. I ate one, left the rest for the other mechanics. The shop felt like a place I belonged, not just a job. I'd lost a client because of my distraction, but I wasn't losing more. I tightened bolts, checked fluids, moved with purpose. Each job was small, but it was mine. I saw Leora again, his room dim, the air thick with the hum of a heater. He was weaker now, his voice a rasp. "I wanted them free," he said, his eyes on the ceiling. That's why I asked about the house. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, listening. He'd known the truth would hurt, but he'd pushed anyway, hoping to lift the shame from my parents. I didn't thank him, didn't forgive him, but I understood. His hand rested on the armrest, thin and veined, and I touched it briefly before leaving. Back at my apartment, I opened the notebook, wrote the date, and added a line about the frost on my windshield that morning. I closed it, set it on the counter, and looked out the window. The city lights, blurred in the distance, steady, unasking. I stood there, Hands in my pockets, the room quiet around me. I wasn't carrying their secrets anymore. I was just here, and that was all I needed. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, the same one I'd set for years. But now, I didn't hit snooze. I got up, made coffee, and stood by the window of my apartment, watching the street below come alive. Delivery trucks rumbled, a jogger passed, with a dog trailing behind. The world moved on, and I was part of it, not stuck in someone else's shadow. My apartment was still sparse. A couch, a table, a lamp that flickered if I bumped it, but it felt like enough. Work was steady now. I'd taken on a new client, a guy with a vintage motorcycle that needed a full rebuild. I spent hours in the shop, my hands moving over the engine, each part fitting where it belonged. When I tightened a bolt, it stayed tight. When I started the bike, it roared to life. I didn't smile, didn't celebrate, but I felt the work settle into me, solid and real. Celine and I were finding our way back. We didn't talk about the house or my parents, but we cooked dinner together some nights, her stirring sauce while I chopped onions. She laughed when I got the measurements wrong, and I let her tease me, her voice filling the small kitchen. We were careful with each other, not pushing too hard, but her presence was a kind of anchor, something I hadn't realized I needed. I saw Thelma and Bernice every couple of weeks. We'd sit in their living room, the same one where Leora's question had cracked everything open. Now we talked about small things, new tires on Bernice's truck, Thelma's plans for a vegetable patch. I didn't ask about the trust or Mabel. They didn't bring it up. It was like we'd drawn a line, not erased but stepped over. Their faces were softer now, less guarded, though Bernice still held his coffee mug like a shield. Leora passed a month ago. It was quiet, no big scene, just a call from the nursing home in the early hours. I went to his room one last time, cleared out his things. There was a box with my name on it, tucked under his bed. Inside was a letter, his handwriting shaky but clear. He apologized not for the debts, but for the weight he'd left on us. I read it once, folded it, and put it in my drawer. It didn't fix anything, but it didn't need to. I kept writing in the notebook, not every day, but most. A line about a customer's bad joke, the way the shop smelled after rain, how Celine's hair caught the light. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about now, about seeing what was in front of me. I closed the notebook one night, set it on the table, and looked out at the city, its lights steady in the dark. I took a breath slow and held it, feeling the quiet settle around me. The days started to blend, not in a haze, but in a rhythm I could feel. I'd wake early, the apartment still dark, and make coffee while the world outside stirred. My hands moved differently now, steadier, whether I was pouring a cup or turning a wrench at the shop. The work wasn't just work anymore. It was a place where I could stand firm, where the pieces fit, because I made them fit. I'd rebuilt an old Jeep suspension last week, the customer shaking my hand when he picked it up, his grin wide. I nodded back, said little, but carried that moment with me. Celine moved in her things, mixing with mine, her books on the shelf, her jacket on the chair. We didn't talk about forever, but we didn't need to. She'd hum while washing dishes, and I'd listen from the couch, the sound settling something in me. We argued sometimes small things, like whose turn it was to buy groceries, but it never felt like a fight. It felt like building. I saw my parents on a Sunday, their kitchen warm with the smell of bread Thelma had baked. Bernice sat at the table, reading glasses low on his nose, flipping through a car magazine. We talked about a storm coming in, about my shop's busy season. The house was just a house now, its walls no longer heavy with secrets. I didn't ask about the trust, and they didn't offer. We'd found a new way to sit together, not perfect, but real. The notebook was almost full, its pages creased from being carried in my truck. I wrote less about the day-to-day, now more about what I saw when I looked up a hawk circling over the highway, the way the shop's windows caught the sunrise. It wasn't about proving I was here anymore. It was about knowing I was. Leora's letter stayed in my drawer unread since that first time. I didn't need to open it again. His apology was his, not mine to carry. I learned something through all this, something I didn't set out to find. Truth doesn't always set you free, but it shows you where you stand. I'd spent years thinking I needed their house, their story, to know who I was. I didn't. I was the guy who fixed engines, who drank coffee with Celine, who wrote about hawks in a cheap notebook. That was enough. What's the one truth you've been afraid to face? The one that might change how you see yourself. If the story hits something in you, maybe give it a like, share it with someone who'd get it, or subscribe for more. Thanks for listening, for being here. I'll see you in the next one.